Noah Reed was only 9 when he asked the one question Cedar Bend Plantation was built to silence. "Mama, why do I look like Mr. Bell?" His mother answered in tears. But the real explosion came later, when Noah carried that truth into daylight, and a whole plantation realized one child's face could become evidence. Why did a child have to ask that question in the first place? Why had his mother spent 9 years teaching him how not to ask it? And why was the most dangerous thing on Cedar Bend not a weapon, but a resemblance no one could explain away forever? The question came at sundown, with the Mississippi heat still trapped inside the cabin walls. Liza Reed had just finished patching a feed sack into a shirt when she noticed Noah had gone quiet again. That had been happening more often. He was still a boy in the ways that mattered. He liked carving little boats out of driftwood. He still laughed when the old mule sneezed. He still ran barefoot after frogs when the yard turned to mud after rain. But lately, silence had started finding him. He stood near the rain barrel outside their cabin, staring down into the water the way grown people stare into graves. His skin was lighter than hers. Not white, never that, but golden in a way nobody on Cedar Bend could miss. His nose was narrower. His chin carried the same hard notch as the man in the big house. And his eyes, when the light hit them wrong, went gray-blue instead of brown. Children noticed difference before adults admit it. The other boys in the quarters had started glancing between Noah and the front porch whenever Mr. Bell rode past. One girl asked him why his hair curled soft instead of tight. Another said he looked like trouble God forgot to finish. Noah had brought all of that home and carried it quietly. Until that evening. "Mama," he said, not turning from the barrel. "Why do I look like Mr. Bell?" The sackcloth slipped from Liza's lap. For a second she did not breathe. Outside, somewhere far off, a mule brayed. A baby cried in another cabin. The quarter went on sounding like itself. But inside Liza, time split cleanly in two, the years before that question, and whatever had to come after it. She had feared this since the day he was born. Not because she thought Noah was too young to understand cruelty. Children born in slavery understood cruelty early. She feared it because once the truth had a shape in his mouth, it could never go back to being only a wound inside her. She stepped outside and saw him still looking into the water. He did not look at her. He looked at the face floating beside the clouds. "The children been saying things," he whispered, "and when Mr. Bell looked at me this morning, it felt like he already knew what I was asking." Liza had been 19 when Silas Bell first cornered her in the curing shed. That was the thing white people in the big house never said aloud. They liked to speak of slavery as work, inheritance, order. They liked ledgers, columns, ownership papers, and Sunday scripture. But underneath all of it was access. Access to black bodies. Access without consequence. Access dressed up as custom until women were expected to survive what they were never permitted to name. Noah had come from one of those nights. She had spent 9 years turning terror into tenderness, trying to give the boy a life bigger than the violence that made him. Now he stood in front of her, waiting for an answer. So she gave him the one thing slavery hated most. The truth. "Because he is your father," she said. The words were soft. The effect was not. Noah turned then, slowly, as if sudden movement might break the world wider. For a moment he looked less shocked than relieved. Not because the truth was kind. Because uncertainty had been worse. He swallowed hard. "Did he hurt you?" Liza closed her eyes. Yes. Noah's whole face changed. Childhood did not leave him all at once. But it stepped back. "Does he know I'm his?" "He's always known." Noah looked toward the big house on the hill, white columns glowing through the trees in the last dirty orange light. The house looked almost holy at a distance. That was one of slavery's favorite tricks. "They call me property," he said. "But if I got his face, how can he pretend not to see me?" Liza reached for him. He let her pull him in. But he did not cry right away. He stood rigid against her, thin shoulders hard, as if he were trying to hold up more than his own body. When the sobs came, they came from somewhere older than 9. Liza rocked him and told him what mothers in impossible worlds tell their children when truth arrives too early and still somehow too late. That blood was not love. That being born from violence did not make him violence. That no white man, no matter what papers he held, got to decide the worth of Noah's soul. When the crying passed, Noah pulled back and wiped his face on his sleeve. A small thing. A child's thing. Then he asked the question that frightened Liza even more than the first. What happens if I ask him? Liza's hand tightened around his wrist. You don't. But why? Because truth don't protect us by itself. Noah looked at the house again. Maybe he was looking for his own eyes in its windows. Maybe he was looking for the place where fear ended. Or maybe, already, he was becoming the kind of child who could not live under a lie once he had seen it clearly. That night, Liza barely slept. She heard every board creak, every footstep in the yard, every distant horse. Before dawn, Ada, a kitchen girl from the big house, slipped past the cabin and did not stop walking. But as she passed, she whispered. Mrs. saw him staring at the master at supper. They talking about it up there. Then she was gone. Liza sat up in the dark. Beside her, Noah was already awake. And in the thin gray light before morning, he said the one thing she had prayed he would not say. I'm tired of carrying his secret for him. Cedar Bend Plantation liked its lies orderly. Cotton in rows. Cabins in rows. Bodies counted in rows. Even shame had a place there, as long as it stayed unspoken. But after Noah's question, something invisible shifted in the quarters. Women looked at him longer. Men who normally kept their eyes low when the master's horse passed, began to look from Noah's face to the porch and back again. Children stopped teasing and started listening. By Sunday, the silence around Noah had changed shape. It was no longer the silence of suspicion. It was the silence before a room decides whether it is going to stay afraid. That afternoon, the plantation gathered behind the small whitewashed chapel the Bells used for services. The enslaved families stood in the back under the sun. The Bells sat up front under shade. Scripture floated across the yard in the soft voice of a visiting minister who spoke of obedience as if it were a ladder to heaven. Noah heard none of it. He watched Silas Bell. The man's hair had gone silver at the temples, but the face was still there. The chin, the eyes, the way irritation gathered at one corner of the mouth before he spoke. And near him stood Henry Bell, the master's legitimate son, home from school in New Orleans with clean cuffs, polished boots, and the careful posture of someone who had spent his life being told he would inherit not only land, but certainty. Henry had noticed Noah too. It was all over his face. That same confused pause. That same unwilling second glance that becomes a third when resemblance refuses to behave like coincidence. After the sermon, rations were being handed out near the storehouse when Silas Bell called out, "Boy, come here." The yard went still. Noah walked forward before Liza could stop him. Amos Pike, the overseer, shifted his weight with one hand near the whip on his belt. Silas Bell stood in front of the barrel of cornmeal, as if rationing itself were part of his authority. "I hear you've been staring at me," Bell said. Noah said nothing. Bell leaned down slightly. "That a habit of yours now?" Liza stepped forward. "Sir, he's only a child. I didn't ask you." Noah could feel every eye in the yard. He heard Aunt June's breathing behind him. He heard Ada stop moving near the porch steps. He heard Henry Bell's boots scrape once on the packed dirt. 9 years old is old enough to know fear. It is also old enough to know when fear is being used to keep somebody else's world intact. So Noah asked the question the plantation had truly been built to silence. "If I'm only property," he said, his voice clear enough to carry, "why did God give me your face?" It did not sound like shouting. That was why it hit so hard. A murmur moved through the people standing behind him. Not loud, not wild, just the sound of recognition finally given permission to exist. Silas Bell's face went white, then red. Henry stared at Noah as if somebody had struck him. Pike took one step forward, but Silas lifted a hand. Noah kept going. "My mama told me the truth. So I'm asking you in daylight. If you knew what I was, why you make me live like a lie?" The minister turned away first. Not because he had no answer, because men like him survive by never being forced to give one. Silas Bell looked around and realized what had happened. The question was no longer private, it now existed in witnesses. That made it dangerous. "What happens in this family," he said coldly, "is no concern of field hands." Noah did not move. "And what happens to my mama?" he asked. "Was that family too?" A woman near the back gasped. Somebody whispered, "Lord." Henry Bell looked at his father, then, really looked at him, and whatever excuse had protected him until that moment began to fail in public. Silas Bell's voice dropped. "Get this boy out of my sight." Liza grabbed Noah's shoulder and pulled him back. But the yard had already changed. No whip cracked. No denial came. And in slavery, silence from power can be louder than confession. That night, the quarters did not sleep. At first people came in twos. Then in threes. Then, after full dark, they slipped one by one into the old praise house beyond the tool sheds, where pine smoke, sweat, and whispered hymns had hidden more truth over the years than the chapel ever had. Aunt June came. Brother Josiah came, carrying a Bible with a hollow cut into the back pages. Ada came from the big house with flour still on her sleeves. Liza came with Noah beside her, one hand fixed to the back of his shirt as if the boy might be stolen by the dark itself. Nobody started with speeches. People started with memory. A woman named Tess said her daughter had her owner's mouth. Another said her son had been sold at 12 because the resemblance got too obvious. An old man said he had buried 2 babies whose fathers stood at the graves pretending not to know them. The room filled with truths that had lived for years as private shame because slavery survives by isolating pain until no one realizes how many people are carrying the same wound. Then Brother Josiah did something small, and because it was small, it was revolutionary. He opened the hollow Bible and took out folded paper. "We start writing them down," he said. The room went still. "Names," he continued. "Mothers. Children. Which men. Birth years. Sale years. Every truth they depend on us forgetting." Ada whispered, "If there's paper, they'll find it." "Then we hide it better," said Aunt June. Noah looked around the room as if he had opened a door and found an entire house behind it. His question was no longer only his. It had become a key. By the end of the meeting, the first page was started in Ada's careful kitchen-hand script. Not a diary. Not a prayer list. A record. A book of names the plantation had never meant to exist. Before dawn, while the ink was still drying, Liza learned from a stable hand that Silas Bell had already given orders to contact a trader downriver. They were going to sell Noah before the cotton was fully in. The threat did exactly what Silas Bell intended. It turned fear into urgency. Once word spread that the master meant to send Noah downriver, every whisper on Cedar Bend sharpened. Sale meant erasure. Sale meant distance large enough to break memory into rumor. Sale meant the answer to one question becoming too expensive for the plantation to allow. Liza stopped breathing properly after that. She worked. She cooked. She mended. She answered when spoken to, but inside, she was counting hours. Noah tried to act brave for her, which only made him look more like a child. He still slept curled on one side.
He still tucked his bare feet under the quilt when he dreamed. Yet now grown men lowered their voices when he entered a room, as if he had become some dangerous, fragile thing the whole quarter was trying to protect. The book grew anyway. That was the part Silas Bell did not understand. Fear can scatter people, but it can also focus them. Ada stole glances at birth notes in the house ledger while cleaning the study. Aunt June supplied years and names from memory no white person had bothered to imagine she possessed. Brother Josiah wrote by candle stub after midnight, printing carefully so no one would mistake what the pages were. Dates. Sales. Children. Marks of resemblance. Mothers' names beside men who would never have admitted them in daylight. Some entries were only fragments. A child called Ruthie, sold south at 6. A boy with bell eyes and weaver hands. Twin girls whose father preached morality from the chapel pulpit. Every line made the room heavier. Every line also made the lie harder to restore. Henry Bell began reading, too. Not the book in the praise house. He did not know about that yet. He began reading his father. At first it was denial. Then fascination. Then disgust. He searched drawers in the study after midnight when the house went quiet. He found bills of sale, plantation inventories, notes on acreage, weather, cotton futures. Ordinary cruelty made efficient by neat penmanship. Then he found stranger things. A payment to a doctor to keep one house girl in service and discreet. A notation about sending a mixed child away before public resemblance creates disorder. A page torn half out, listing names of women beside initials only the family would recognize. Henry stared at the ink until the words blurred. The plantation he was raised to inherit had always been violent. He knew that in the abstract. But abstraction had protected him. The papers did not. They made appetite visible. They made pattern visible. And once pattern appears, innocence becomes harder to perform. 2 nights before the trader was expected, Henry came to Liza's cabin after dark. He did not knock at first. He stood outside long enough that Noah woke before the sound came. Liza opened the door with a knife hidden in her apron. Henry looked terrible. Not weak. Not noble.
Stripped of whatever comfortable ignorance had dressed him all his life. He means to sell the boy by Thursday, Henry said. And maybe you after, if he thinks you stirred this. Liza said nothing. Henry took a folded page from inside his coat. It was a shipping note with a trader's route marked in pencil. New Orleans first, then farther south. Noah looked from the paper to Henry's face. Why are you helping? Henry swallowed. Because the true answer was ugly. Because blood had finally become real to him only when it threatened to inconvenience his conscience. Because a child had asked one honest question in public and made him hear every lie in his own name. Because he's my brother, Henry said at last, looking at Noah, not Liza. And because I should have known what kind of house this was, long before he forced me to. That did not make everything clean. It only made the next choice possible. Brother Josiah was sent for. Aunt June came. The book was brought wrapped in flour cloth, and laid on the table between them like a living thing. Henry stared at it. What is this? The part they can't sell if it leaves here, Josiah said. Henry turned pages with shaking hands. Names filled them. Not rumors, not gossip. A ledger of exploitation written from below instead of above. His father kept books to prove ownership. This book existed to prove violation. You can't carry this in a child and move fast, Henry said. We carry both, Liza answered. Outside, a board creaked. Then another. Everyone in the room froze. Amos Pike's dogs had been restless all evening. Someone had seen lanterns beyond the gin shed. Whether from betrayal, suspicion, or plain plantation instinct, the raid had started early. Shouting cut across the quarter. A door slammed open somewhere. A woman screamed. Brother Josiah blew out the candle. Darkness swallowed the room whole. Take the back, Aunt June whispered. Henry shoved the marked trader's route and a brass key into Lisa's hand. Smokehouse first. River Road after. There's a skiff below Miller's Landing if it hasn't been moved. Noah grabbed the wrapped book. Lisa grabbed Noah. And while dogs barked and boots pounded through the dark, mother and son slipped out the back of the cabin and ran toward the smokehouse with the one thing Silas Bell wanted erased tucked against a 9-year-old boy's chest. Inside, among salt barrels and hanging meat, they crouched without breathing as the dogs drew closer. Then Noah leaned against his mother and whispered the sentence no child should ever have to say. If they take me, make sure the names still get out. Lisa could hear the patrol before she could make sense of it. Lantern glass rattling. Men cursing. Boots in mud. Dogs dragging chains until the chains went slack and the barking turned sharp. In the dark of the smokehouse, Noah's heartbeat felt strong through the cloth-wrapped book pressed between them. Lisa held him so tightly it was almost another kind of fear. Outside, Cedar Bend sounded like a plantation trying to close its fist. But the problem with fists is that once something sharp is already inside them, closing harder only deepens the wound. A lantern paused outside the smokehouse door. Someone tested the latch. Lisa reached for the butcher knife she'd taken from the cabin and knew, with terrible clarity, that if the door opened, this story would end here, in salt air, in darkness, in one wild useless act of protection. Then a voice cut through the yard. Not here. Henry Bell shouted. Pike, check the lower road. I saw tracks headed to the landing. The lantern moved. A curse followed. Boots splashed away. Noah looked up at his mother in disbelief. Henry had not just helped them privately. He had chosen a side where other white men could hear him. That was a different kind of treason. A minute later the smokehouse door opened anyway, but only wide enough for Henry to slide in sideways and pull it shut behind him. He was breathing hard, coat soaked through with sweat and humidity. They'll circle back, he said. You have maybe 10 minutes. He handed Lisa a folded pass stamped with his father's seal. Freight transfer authorization. If anyone catches you before the landing, you show this and keep moving. Josiah slipped in behind him, then Aunt June, then Ada with a bundle tied in a checked cloth. The whole conspiracy of the overlooked had somehow narrowed itself into that black space between salt and wood smoke. Ada shoved the bundle into Lisa's hands. Cornbread, dried apples, Fred and needle. Aunt June reached for Noah's face, thumb against his cheek like she was trying to memorize the bone beneath the skin. Josiah took the book, untied it, and without a word began tearing out half the pages. Lisa stared at him. What are you doing? Splitting the truth, he said. If one copy falls, the other lives. Pattern interrupt. Not escape. Duplication. Resistance had learned to think like fire, never travel with only one flame. Ada tucked half the pages into the lining of her dress. Lisa took the rest. Aunt June slid a needle through the hem of Noah's blanket and began stitching the packet inside with astonishing speed, hands moving by feel. We ain't got time, Henry urged. We making time, June muttered, biting thread. When she finished, the blanket looked ordinary again. Just another poor child's coverlet, patched and faded. Exactly the kind of thing white men stopped seeing after one glance. They moved out in a staggered line. Josiah first to listen. Henry second to misdirect if needed. Noah bent low behind them. Ada peeled off toward the kitchens with the other pages hidden against her ribs. The quarter was chaos in pockets, doors open, women crying, Pike shouting orders he did not fully understand. Men with torches had expected a meeting they could break apart, a few bodies they could frighten. They had not expected truth to already be moving in pieces through the plantation like contraband breath. At the horse yard, Eli the blacksmith was waiting beside a wagon missing one wheel. He had taken it apart on purpose and laid himself in the mud beside it as if working late. Roads blocked for a spell, he said without looking at them. Go. They crossed the cotton gin yard, then the cane brake, then the narrow path sloping down to Miller's Landing, where the river took on that strange night sheen that makes black water look metallic. For one impossible second, it almost felt like they might actually reach it. The skiff was still there, tied low beneath the bank, and beside it stood a broad-shouldered deckhand named Reuben, a free black riverman who worked freight between landings and asked no questions he did not need answered. Josiah had reached farther than Liza knew. Reuben lifted one hand. "You got 1 minute. Maybe less." Then lanterns flared above them. Silas Bell had not been fooled after all. He stepped down the bank with Amos Pike and 2 armed men behind him, light hitting one side of his face and turning the other into shadow. Henry stopped moving. So did Liza. Noah clutched the blanket so hard his knuckles vanished. Silas Bell looked at the scene below him. His legitimate son, the woman he had violated, the child who wore his face, the dark river, the skiff, the night, and for the first time in the story, Power looked panicked. "Henry," he said, "move aside." Henry didn't. Pike lifted his rifle. Reuben shifted 1 foot into the boat. The river slapped once against the wood, and hanging over everything was the thing no one said aloud. If Noah crossed that water with those pages, Cedar Bend would never own its own history again. Silas Bell's voice came out low and raw. "You would betray your family for this." Henry answered without taking his eyes off Noah. "I am." For one suspended second, nobody moved. The river breathed. Lantern flames shook in the wind. Behind Liza, Noah whispered, "Mama." Not loud, not frightened, exactly. Just young enough to remind the knight who stood at the center of it. Silas Bell heard it too. His face tightened with something uglier than rage. Recognition. Because beneath all the property law and plantation ritual and inherited violence, he was being forced to watch the simplest truth in the world refuse him. That boy was his. And the boy wanted nothing from him except distance. Pike raised the rifle again. Henry stepped in front of it. "Don't," he said. Silas Bell's voice cracked like dry wood. "He leaves here, and every scavenger north of the river will have a story to print. Every enemy of this state will get exactly what they want." Josiah answered from the shadows, "No, sir. They'll get what you made." That was the line. Not shouted, placed. And once placed, it split the night clean down the middle. Pike lunged first, not toward Josiah, but toward Noah, because men like him always understand instinctively where the truth is physically carried. Liza moved without thinking. So did Henry. Pike grabbed the blanket. Henry struck his arm away. The rifle fired into the air, the blast rolling across the river hard enough to wake birds from the reeds. Noah stumbled backward into Reuben's chest. Liza shoved him toward the skiff. "Go." But Noah did not go until he looked once at Silas Bell. One last question still sat inside him. You could see it, 9 years old, barefoot in the mud, carrying pages that could outlive a plantation. He said, "If I'm only your shame, why you so afraid of my name?" Silas Bell actually flinched. Not because the words wounded him morally. Men like him were too armored for that. He flinched because the boy had found the exact nerve under the armor, public memory. If Noah got away, this was no longer a secret sin buried in one county. It was testimony. Pike recovered and came again. This time Henry met him full on, driving him sideways into the bank. The lantern flew from Pike's hand and burst in the mud, flame licking along spilled oil toward the stacked rotting boards near the landing. Reuben seized the moment. He dragged Noah into the skiff, hauled Liza after him, and shoved off with a boathook so hard the little craft lurched sideways into the current. Josiah jumped last. The rope snapped free. Water opened between shore and boat. Amos Pike shouted. One of the armed men fired and missed wide. Silas Bell did not shoot. Maybe he feared hitting Henry, maybe, for one fractured second. He could not bring himself to put a bullet through the face he had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Maybe panic had finally made him useless. Whatever the reason, the river took the choice from him. From the skiff, Liza saw the landing begin to burn where the lantern oil had caught old timber. Not a grand fire.
Not a cinematic inferno.
Just enough flame to throw everybody's features into violent light. She saw Henry on the bank, chest heaving, held back by two men, and no longer trying to look like their kind. She saw Silas Bell standing perfectly still while smoke rose behind him, and the river widened between him and the child who had undone him. She saw Cedar Bend shrinking. Noah looked at none of it. He dropped to the bottom of the skiff, wrapped both arms around the blanket, and finally cried, not because he was weak, but because children are not built to carry whole systems across rivers without the body asking to be a child again somewhere in the middle of it. Lisa gathered him into her lap. Reuben rowed. Josiah prayed under his breath, then stopped praying and started planning, because freedom is never reached by faith alone. They would not be safe the next morning, or the next month. There were still patrols, still laws, still distance between a river crossing and a free life. But the pages were moving, and movement was everything. Years later, after war had ripped open the South, and the old certainties began collapsing under their own rot, a different kind of gathering took place in a former courthouse not far from Natchez. No chains, no auction block, no planter seated above the room pretending he was history itself. People came with scraps of paper, names remembered in fragments, sale years, mothers' names, scars, counties, half-finished family stories. And among those papers was a weathered packet first stitched into a child's blanket on the night Cedar Bend tried to close its hand. The pages were copied, read aloud, added to by others. A record grown from one question asked beside a rain barrel. Some mothers found children because of those names. Some children learned which man had fathered them and never claimed them. Some families did not get reunion, only proof. But in a country built on denying black testimony, proof was no small thing. Noah learned to read the pages himself. That mattered to him, not because blood had become precious, but because language had. Once, in that old courtroom, he read his mother's name aloud beside his own and did not lower his voice for either one. Lisa listened from the back row, older now, hands lined and strong, and understood that the question she had dreaded most had not destroyed her son. It had turned him into a witness. Maybe that was the real spark. Not confrontation, not escape, not even courage, by itself. But the moment one child refused to carry a powerful man's lie in silence, and other people, hearing him, decided to write their own truths down too. Cedar Bend was built on cotton, fear, and forgetting. But in the end, a boy with the master's face gave it something it could not survive. A record.